Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ian Pad. I'm the Peacemonger. It is Monday, the 2nd of March. In the evening, I'm delighted to welcome Kit Klarenberg. Kit is an amazing investigative journalist. He looks into the role of intelligence agencies in shaping policy and perceptions, and actually produces some fantastic, very, very forensic and analytical pieces, which you can find on his Substack and lots of other places. Kind of besides, Kit can tell you all about that. But Kit, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Ian. My pleasure.
Uh, I was prompted to kind of reach out to you. You sent me a really fascinating piece, which I've shared on X, that you wrote in October 2024, essentially kind of predicting that the military kind of power balance in West Asia had almost irrevocably shifted in Iran's favor, and actually, essentially, to paraphrase, the US and Israel would struggle if they decided at a later time to mount military action, which is exactly what is playing out before our eyes right now. So you're a bit like Zhang Huiqin, who's actually predicted this all along. You're another kind of predictor of what's actually happening. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I can't claim to be possessed of your Nostradamus style, foresight. I just thought that based on trends and based on the fact that Iran had repeatedly demonstrated that it had the ability to pierce Israel and tie up Israeli air defense and US air defense. And they'd also, the US and Israel had also demonstrated that not only was it very difficult for them to respond to this, but also the fact it was quite clear that based on the US basing structure in West Asia, that Iran, with its vast arsenal of hypersonic and ballistic missiles, which which the US cannot shoot down, no country can shoot them down because they're so fast, and it's quite unbelievable, really. That the US was going to be in real trouble if it kickstarted a conflict with Iran. And there was a very interesting report by there's an organization called Ginsa, the Jewish Institute for National Security of America. This is a very influential, rather shadowy Zionist think tank, which is staffed by veteran military and intelligence people, and it not only influences the training of U.S. police forces by Israeli occupation forces, it also is involved in trying to influence U.S. foreign policy in the interest of Israel. And I might add that Colin Powell, when he gave that rather infamous speech to the UN in the lead up to Iraq, where he waved around that vial of anthrax and suggested that Iran was a major, chemical, biological, and nuclear threat to the West, he subsequently blamed the speech's content on the quote unquote Ginsa crowd. So, I mean, these are extremely well connected and listened to experts on military and intelligence matters, and they're very, very pro-Israel. They published this report in September that year. It was called US Bases in the Middle East Overcoming the Tyranny of Geography. And it was authored by the former CENTCOM commander, Frank McKenzie, who oversaw the US's absolutely disastrous retreat from Afghanistan in 2021, which has been rather forgotten now. It was hugely embarrassing, total catastrophe. But anyway, the point McKenzie makes the point in this report over and over again that, yeah, that Iran could strike us very, very easily, if they wanted to hit US military bases, which they are likely to do in the event of all-out conflict. Then there's very little we can do to counter that. They could take out US fighter jets, US personnel, US military equipment, and our ability to counter that is rather limited, if not non-existent. But what was also interesting from that report was that it was quite clear that McKenzie, and I guess by extension, elements of the US power structure, thought that Iran's lack of response to assassinations, destabilization, meddling, attempted intervention, etc., that their restraint was seen as a sign of weakness. And the fact that Iran didn't cause mass infrastructure destruction, that it didn't slaughter masses of civilians, it was seen as impotence on the part of the Iranians. And the report concludes by basically stating that, well, we've really got nothing to worry about, and ultimately Iran's April 2024 attack, the very first Operation True Promise, demonstrates that we can very easily fight back against Tehran. So it was a bit of cognitive dissonance, but I think that mindset is probably quite prevalent. Now, we fast forward to the start of this, godforsaken conflict, and everything that was predicted, in this report came to pass, apart from the being able to fight back part, because quite clearly, I mean, we saw this in the 12-day war. Israel launched that with much fanfare last year, and they were initially talking about taking down the Islamic Republic and triggering mass revolution, etc. And then within days, they were almost out of air interceptors and were in real trouble. And the US had to step in to save them. And this went on for another week or so, and then finally there was a kind of rather brittle ceasefire, and the amount of very expensive and very difficult to replace missiles that were used by the US and Israel in fighting back, often against very low cost drones, and rather ancient missiles that were just kind of dug out of a stockpile somewhere. It was about 20 to 30% of the US's total missile interceptor stockpile. Now, and based on current production rates, they'll take about 8 years to replace. I mean, the US has been having very serious problems with its stockpiles of all manner of things since the start of the Ukraine proxy war, and the US has made a number of very bold commitments to building, say, 100,000 artillery shells a month, and they can't do it. And consistently, targets have to be pared back or halved, drastically reduced. So I had this very clear sense going into this conflict exactly what was going to happen, and it's by and large played out to the letter. I must say, I did not factor in the Iranians taking it upon themselves to target British assets in Cyprus, which is quite extraordinary, or indeed the explosion of anti-US, anti-Zionist protests, which have engulfed the Arab and Muslim world. I certainly didn't expect that the Gulf states would be under such threat and have their airspaces closed, and that Iran would be hitting the hotel rooms housing military and intelligence personnel with pinpoint precision, which is quite extraordinary. So actually, I myself underestimated the Iranian response, but I don't think that Western powers have any real contingency plan for dealing with this. They were completely unprepared. I think it's been reported that the US and Israel thought this would last a few days, and then Iran would be suitably subjugated and battered, that they would accept whatever terms were put in front of them. They're refusing to back down. It's quite clear that the Iranian people and the state believe this is existential and they're in for the long haul. Now we're hearing this could last for weeks or months. I don't think that the US or Israel has the capacity to last very long. And you've got to bear in mind that since October 7th, Israel has been, while it's in theory made some major gains, and it's not only completely flattened Gaza, it's also seized areas of the Golan Heights, and is trying to move in on Lebanon again. The fact of the matter is, this has been completely ravaging for Israel. They've suffered mass brain drain and population collapse as people go back to their actual home countries. Their economy is in absolute tatters and is basically held afloat by unending US loans. Their international sympathy for Israel is basically zero at this point, including in the countries which are central to its continued existence. All it's going to take is maybe one anti-Zionist politician to secure office, and there'll be a huge domino effect with governments backing off from lockstep support for Tel Aviv. So I mean, they're in a very, very precarious position, and their population is spending nights in bunkers while their cities get absolutely flattened. Again, I don't think they could last a protracted period, and Iran is showing every intention of doing so and every ability to do so.
In the UK, I mean, and actually all across Europe, frankly, politicians seem to be in a complete panic now about this. I mean, I kind of think that Starmer felt burned by the Gaza situation, having been limp to completely invisible in terms of any sort of credible response to what was happening there, at the time. And I don't think he's recovered from that. And now I think the kind of pro Palestine movement in the UK is so kind of powerful and the political feelings run so high, and his popularity rating is on the slide anyway, just because of the general political and economic situation, in the country, that he finds himself in a position of not really knowing what policy to take on, on what's happening in Iran, beyond quite bizarre. I don't know if you saw the UN Security Council meeting, blaming Iran for it, but not having a clue of how the UK can engage. I mean, what's your sense of how broken the UK policy position is on it right now?
Oh yeah, well, I mean, it's a complete and utter embarrassment. And I mean, initially Starmer made that statement where he said, "We're not going to get involved, and this has nothing to do with us, but British jets are in the air." Then Starmer made some tub-thumping commitments that he was going to, along with France and Germany, was going to back up the US and Israel as they were under threat, coming to the rescue of their allies. And now they backed off even from that. I mean, and also Trump was unhappy even then, despite bending over for Washington. Trump was unhappy with this because he felt that Starmer wasn't enthusiastic or quick or off the draw enough. And the Cypriot government has made abundantly clear that they do not want to be part of this, and that they're not going to have the UK drag them in to a wider conflict, which is exactly what would happen. I mean, already the Akrotiri base has been shut down. Cyprus's airports have been shut down due to the threat of Iranian fire. Now, I think that just more generally, there is a very, very serious problem here for the British in that, Cyprus since the 1950s has basically been a British, parts of it have served as British sovereign territory, and more widely, because of the profusion of British military and intelligence apparatchiks on the island, it effectively operates like a British colony. And, I went there many years ago, and it's just, crawling with often very drunk British squaddies who the locals don't seem to like very much. But I mean, this is the result of the British fighting a brutal counterinsurgency war following World War II, where they committed absolutely horrendous atrocities against the local population, trying to put down a communist rebellion. So I mean, within Cyprus itself, yeah, the British presence is very unpopular. Most British citizens don't know about it, and it was only due to the centrality of Britain's Cyprus base to the Gaza genocide that people actually started, being aware that Britain has a permanent presence there. And, I mean, this was used to send spy planes to monitor Gaza. This was used to ferry military equipment and special forces soldiers who were, directly involved in the Gaza genocide. And, Keir Starmer, I believe it was late 2024, I might be off on the date, he actually personally visited Cyprus and openly said to a crowd of British soldiers there, it's great what you're doing. We can't tell anyone what you're doing here, but congratulations, and rah rah, God save the king. And yeah, I mean, this is a real problem now because it's being openly discussed in Cyprus mainstream politics, and that's having a knock-on effect elsewhere. I think that one of the really remarkable things is how not only has the Iranian attack exposed the weakness of Western imperialism, it's also just exposed Western imperialism. As Khomeini himself said, the best part of, I think more than 10 years ago, he tweeted saying, why is the US in the West Asia? Why do they have so many bases? What is their interest here? And, this is stuff that doesn't really get talked about. And, average people are seeing that the Britain, America, and other imperial powers have this huge military presence all over the world, particularly in West Asia. And this is usually used to prop up completely illegitimate and unpopular and very brutal and corrupt regimes, such as the Bahraini government, which don't represent the population's wishes or interests at all, and deal with dissent via brutality. And often their security and law enforcement and military agencies are trained by the British and the Americans, purely for the purposes of domestic repression. And so, all of this is a house of cards which could very easily collapse. And I mean, there are, Saudi officials have stated that they feel that they've been abandoned by the US, and that the US is only interested in protecting Israel, not its Gulf clients. Well, I mean, a sales pitch that that Britain has employed in order to expand and maintain its presence in West Asia is that they're a source of security and stability. Well, all of the UAE being a British created monarchy, and heavily with a huge presence of British and other foreign workers. These people are now fleeing, and they're not getting any reassurance whatsoever from Western governments at all. So, I mean, this is a much wider long-term issue, I think. And I mean, there is talk of the Foreign Office trying to arrange transportation for the hundreds of thousands of British citizens who are in Abu Dhabi and Dubai because their airports are closed as well. They're not going to come back, most likely, Britain has shown itself completely unwilling and unable to defend these countries if they come under attack. So, I mean, again, where does that leave Britain? A much reduced, and actually rather irrelevant little island off the coast of Western Europe, that poses as a major global military, economic, and diplomatic power, but really isn't.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I can tell you exactly what the evacuation will look like. At the last minute, we'll trump up some charter airlines that nobody has ever heard of before, and rush them in and ask people to add themselves to the list to pay £2,000 per ticket,
Yeah.
at least to fly back, and the whole thing will be a complete cluster. Yeah, I know this because I was involved in the COVID repatriation at the time. We're just rubbish at this. And actually, I mean, my view on the kind of why are we in West Asia? I mean, I think, particularly in the context of the sort of very tentative steps towards rapprochement between Saudi and Iran, and I emphasize tentative, that actually there is a kind of movement, among the developing world more broadly, but in the Middle East in particular, to kind of align more with kind of BRICS groupings and that sort of thing. And I think actually the primary role for the US, obviously with Israel, but also kind of compliant Western hangers-on like the UK, is to kind of prevent that sort of normalization across the Islamic world as a whole, in the Middle East. I mean, that's just a take that I have. I mean, if you look at Iran, for example, in terms of its economic growth rate, I mean, from the early 1990s through to the early noughties, before sanctions really started to ramp up in about 2010, 2011, Iran's growth rate had been remarkable. Actually, it'd been on a really kind of steady ascent, almost like China style in terms of the progress it had made. But it's been held back by sanctions using the pretext of this bomb that's 2 years just ahead of us in the making, as a pretext to kind of suppress them. That's certainly how I read it anyway. I mean, Iran could be a prosperous, it could be an affluent, a state, and I think that militates against our interest in terms of maintaining a division between Iran and Saudi in particular, but across the Middle East as a whole. I mean, that's just my theory, but I mean, what do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, Iran I mean, it is an ancient power and civilization, and it has, historically been enormously powerful within West Asia and beyond. And I think, I mean, it's interesting you mentioned, the sanctions and Iran's growth before that. I mean, I was actually a financial journalist when the sanctions were lifted under the Obama era agreement. That was like 2015. I knew a large number of people, kind of professional investors and fund managers, who were absolutely cock a hoop because Iran is an extremely developed country with a very well-educated workforce. It's full of scientists and engineers. I mean, and there were enormous opportunities there, and it also, I mean, it has a culture of investment and stuff. So it's like, I mean, it was the kind of environment that had never been seen in an emerging market before. There were a lot of people who were very excited about it. Of course, Trump tore that up. But I mean, historically, because of Iran's size and because of its historical cultural influence, its connections with other countries in the region, it's always been destined to be a major player, were it not for Western meddling or attempts to suppress them. I mean, Richard Helms, who was the longtime CIA chief and then became the U.S. ambassador to Iran, he referred to the country as the geopolitical center of the world in the 1970s. And despite the fact it was ruled by the Shah with brutally by his British and American trained secret police, the SAVAK, Iran was developing at an absolutely extraordinary pace and rate under his rule. And then following the Islamic Revolution, it continued apace. I think that the sanctions in general sanctions are just criminal. I think in pretty much every conceivable case, and they invariably inflict misery, poverty, and outright death on civilian populations, while not really challenging the foundation of power of target governments at all. I mean, we've seen this over and over and over again. And of course, in Iraq in the 90s, there were more than 500,000 children killed by US sanctions, which, oh God, what's her name? Who was the State Department official who said that 500,000 children is sorry? Madeleine, no, it was Madeleine Albright who said she went on TV and she openly said that 500,000 dead Iraqi children was a price worth paying. It was, a difficult decision to make, but they felt it was worth it. And this just grinds countries into absolute dust and hampers their development. And yes, as I say, results in preventable deaths, etc. But I think in Iran's case, it was particularly it was particularly criminal because they were imposed on the basis of a lie that was cooked up by MI6. Now, this is something that I've reported on for the Grey Zone and my own website. But we reported on leaks at the Grey Zone that showed that from 2006 until 2012, which is precisely the period that European governments and major international institutions, including the EU and UN, started levying extremely hard, kind of historically harsh sanctions on the Islamic Republic. This was when MI6 was involved in an effort in a black propaganda effort to spread the idea amongst these amongst the very organizations and bodies and governments that were doing the sanctioning, that Iran had nuclear ambitions, and they were also involved in trying to infiltrate the International Atomic Energy Association and convince them that that Iran had nuclear ambitions, if not possessed nukes already. So I mean, I remember very well, like during this period, the level of hysteria in the media, and you had like mainstream, which at the time had significantly higher viewing figures than they do now. Like shows like Question Time, it would be stated axiomatically by talking heads, well, Iran is a nuclear threat, and it's a lie. Like it just wasn't true. Khomeini imposed a fatwa on nuclear weapons. I'm not so sure that Iran, whoever replaces him, will be as adverse, because quite clearly, as North Korea demonstrates, it's a very effective means of getting the West to leave you alone, and not attempt to overthrow your government or invading you. But the point is these sanctions were imposed, and then the trade-off under Obama was that if you allow for the IAEA to verify your compliance, then we'll offer you sanctions relief. Now, I mean, the association then went on to consistently certify that Iran wasn't pushing for nuclear weapons, and it was an absolutely extraordinary level of coverage. Like they had 24/7 perpetually watched live stream footage inside Iranian nuclear facilities. Like there was there was no indication that they were enriching uranium for military purposes. And this got torn up in May 2018, and under Trump's quote unquote maximum pressure campaign. So it's just like I think that not only do these sanctions, as you say, kind of cause issues between Iran and countries within the region, and indeed this notion that Iran is trying to develop nuclear weapons. It's at the core of Western support for Salafist elements who very much drove the regional conflicts, which were during this period, which were largely proxy conflicts between Iran and Saudi Arabia. But it also it serves to demonize Iran in the eyes of Western citizens. When I mean, there's an enormous amount to recommend about Iran. I know a great many people who visited and absolutely adore it. As a country, my parents visited in the 1970s, and they said that they were very welcome and that they were stunned by the kind of the culture they experienced, etc. So it's like, by turning it into this international pariah, it doesn't help anyone. But it does, create this perpetual need for Western occupation because, oh, well, the Iranians are dangerous and they're a threat to you, and therefore that means that, the British and the Americans and other Western powers, have a justification for continuing to occupy West Asia when nobody wants them there. So I mean, it's a real shame, and I think that, of course, the war against Iran was launched while talks were ongoing, and there are many people who
Mm.
question the wisdom of Iranian leaders for going along with it because they thought that war was inevitable. Well, I think that if they didn't understand before, the Iranian leaders very much understand now that you can't negotiate with these people, and they're going to have to carve their own way, and just avoid subjugating themselves under the illusion of diplomacy. There is a Russian military thinker called Igor Korochenko, who said, this Anglo-Saxon breed understands nothing but force. And I think that, that at last, maybe London and Brussels and Washington and Berlin and Paris are getting the point that Iran isn't this basket case punching bag.
Yeah, I completely agree. You just made me think when I first joined the Foreign Office, there's this senior diplomat is due to be ambassador to Iran, but he didn't get agreement. He didn't get agreement to go, but he still used to go on holiday to Northern Iran because he liked it so much. It's quite a funny character. I think one of the, I think in terms of Anglo-Saxon, we have a tendency to kind of think about our strategy in quite quite a linear way, without thinking about the reciprocal action of our opponent. In this case, Iran. We assume that the certain input of force, over a set period of time will deliver an outcome based on what we know and understand of the opponent, right? And well, actually, in fact, as we've seen in Ukraine with kind of Russia's constantly evolving approach, and as we're seeing now in Iran, I mean that that they have completely upended any working assumptions. Even if there was a plan, I'm not really sure there was really a plan on the American side going into this about how they'll respond. And what appears to me is happening is that they are seeking actively to kind of radicalize, as you said right at the top. In fact, the kind of the Gulf states, against the occupying Americans, which will very obviously was not in there can't have been in American planning documents. Because the whole Gulf state has been locked down, airspace closed, Hormuz shut. I mean, all of these things were eminently kind of predictable, and yet nobody seems to have predicted them. And it's quite shocking to me that actually there's such a lack of a strategic thinking behind what the Americans have been doing there, and they seem destined to fail. I mean, quite quickly, and hence Hegseth appearing to kind of step gingerly and with many religious and nationalist kind of homilies towards the exit ramp. I mean, that's how. I mean, I think the Americans are trying to get out of it at the moment, and they don't know how. Particularly as Iran has said that they won't negotiate with the US now, and for possibly understandable reasons, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, wars are very easy to get into and they're very difficult to get out of. I mean, I think we're seeing that with Ukraine, where it's like, I mean, by flooding Ukraine with weapons and making all of these promises to them and giving them so much money, they've created a monster. I mean, they really. I think that there's a lot of debate about whether Trump and his administration ever really wanted to end the war in Ukraine. And it's just, I think that it's almost the wrong debate to have because, I mean, yeah, that like Kiev is in a position where it doesn't feel it needs to capitulate, and there are enough people, at least in the mainstream Western politics, who are all in on Ukraine, including the EU's god awful foreign policy apparatus led by Kaya Kallas.
Mm.
just a dreadful like dreg of humanity that that they know that they can just refuse to negotiate. But like, yeah, I mean, yeah, this is a total disaster, and I think that it is important to understand that, like, yes, for all of the enormous amount of money spent on on spying and intelligence operations targeting major like kind of major powers, in particular China and Russia, but also places like Iran and regions like West Asia. Like, the level of understanding in these of kind of cultural historic understanding is almost completely lacking, to an extent that's really, really dangerous. And it's like, I mean, you've got to bear in mind that, like, the Bush administration was certainly talking up the prospects of conflict with Iran, and there were, during his administration, there were US think tanks that were publishing guides to triggering conflict with Iran, just because reasons. But there were elements within the mainstream, both in the media and politics and punditry, that understood that this would be a total disaster, which is why the Bush administration didn't do it. And like, that's just been kind of lost now with this total fantasy that that America is still at its kind of unipolar peak of power. I mean, those days are long over, and I think there's something that there was another data point that I've referenced quite a lot in discussing the current conflict, but I think it can't be stressed enough. In July 2024, the Associated Press published a very interesting report on the return to the States of US pilots and sailors who had been involved in Operation Prosperity Guardian. Operation Prosperity Guardian, for just for the sake of context, was a 9-month long effort by the US to crush Ansar Allah in Yemen, and it was launched with much fanfare. And there were a lot of America First morons who were shrieking and hollering about how the Yemenis were about to find out why the US doesn't have healthcare, and this grand US naval flotilla went to the Red Sea to end Ansar Allah's blockade of the Red Sea, and then failed miserably, and then just beat a hasty retreat with its tail between its legs. Now, the Associated Press spoke to some of the pilots and sailors returning, and they described being under attack by Ansar Allah as deeply traumatizing, because they'd never been shot at before. And Ansar Allah, for all of their determination and dedication, this was a highly asymmetric battle. Yemen is, like, according to official GDP figures, for whatever they're worth, not very much, is the poorest country on earth, and they were subject to a 10-year genocidal carpet bombing led by the Saudis and other Gulf states with the assistance of Britain and America. And they effectively defeated this grand US naval flotilla. And in the process, they nearly struck US aircraft carriers. They nearly struck US jets. And they were under relentless attack. Now, Iran is not Ansar Allah. Iran has a pretty developed military. Of course, its air force and navy aren't anything to shout about, but it has invested enormous amounts of time, energy, and money in developing ballistic and hypersonic missiles and other and drone technology. And this is not something that the US and Israel can counter. So, I mean, the fact that they would have gotten involved in this, despite their past experiences, kind of recent experiences in the region, it does speak to a certain level of kind of institutional amnesia. I mean, this said, there were people in the mainstream leading up to this. I reviewed some of them for Al Mayadeen, who were saying that this would be a total disaster and you shouldn't do it. This included Dan Kane, who's the head of the General Chiefs of Staff. So he's effectively the most powerful military official in the country. There are some people who get it. And I think this is actually, it's one of the reasons I inversely do worry about a wider conflict being sparked with Russia, because yes, there are people within the power structure who understand this, but then often not actually the people who make decisions. And I'm not seeing a tremendous degree of cognizance of the limits of Western power. I mean, they do get reminded, as we just discussed. Starmer initially going from saying that he was going to assist the US and Israel to saying that he wasn't within a couple of hours. After the base in Cyprus gets struck by Iranian drones. But the fact that the will is still there is really quite worrying. And I think I mean, in respect of the Ukraine conflict, where is a single mainstream European politician or anyone in a position of power who's calling for de-escalation and negotiation? Like really?
Well, I mean, there aren't any.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
none
Like,
at all.
and this is despite the fact that this is like clearly irretrievably lost to the extent that Foreign Affairs, which is the official journal of the Council on Foreign Relations, has published an article saying Ukraine has lost and cannot regain territory. It must negotiate now.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is systemic. Um, I mean, if I firstly go back to the point on intelligence, the value of intelligence is in its interpretation.
Mm,
Because you know what intelligence is like. I mean, okay, you may talk to somebody or you may listen to somebody's phone,
mm,
but that they might be telling you what you want to hear, or actually the person on the phone probably thinks they're being listened to, and they might also be kind of saying stuff in the knowledge they're being overheard, right? So I mean, intelligence is about how you interpret it, but you can only interpret intelligence if you have a real understanding of the subject and the country that you're thinking about in terms of their mindset, why they think, how they think, why they might be kind of discussing whatever they're discussing at any given time. And that goes back to the kind of point about the system in the UK. We just don't have anybody who's steeped, or we have a declining stock of people who are steeped in expertise of the Middle East, of obviously Russia and Ukraine, and so on. We've had a massive increase in staff, particularly since 2014, particularly on Russia and Ukraine. None of them know Scoobies about about Russia. They don't speak Russian. They've never been
mm,
to Russia. They've never met a Russian person. And these are the people breathlessly reading the Guardian, going to Chatham House meetings in Russia and saying it's all Putin's fault and he's going to die soon and the Russia's economy is going to collapse tomorrow and the Russian tanks are being fitted with spare parts from washing machines. I mean, the problem is systemic.
mm,
The
mm.
government is full of idiots because we stopped investing in understanding our adversaries, or indeed our, potential future allies. Because I mean, I personally have nothing against the Russians, myself, and I think that is the problem, and that is also related to that the problem with intelligence. That even if you can have the best intelligence in the world, if you've got idiots interpreting it, then there's still
Mm.
idiotic advice, and because the whole kind of system is infected with like the media, the think tanks, everybody's speaking in the same echo chamber. It's hard to get anything bouncing, even advice from embassies. It tends to just bounce off the system, and that is
Mm.
I just don't know how you break that problem. And of course, politicians are all idiots too, because I mean we've had 9, 10 foreign secretaries since 2014. They're there for a year and a half, and they don't develop any expertise, but they get their briefing from the officials and they trot it out as if it's true. So I just don't know how you kind of break out of that. I don't know. I mean, maybe Craig Murray knows. I mean, he would that this would resonate with him. I'm perfectly sure. But I mean, that is a problem. That's why we can't escape.
Mm. Well,
Uh,
it's interesting. It's interesting that you say that because I remember that there was a mainstream media report that really sticks out in my mind. I think it might be from a couple of years ago now, where effectively, and it might have been Richard Moore, the now former head of MI6,
hmm.
who said, "Well, we're really struggling to get worthwhile intelligence from China because due to a lack of Chinese language skills within the agency and a lack of cultural awareness." And it's like, well, I mean, maybe if you spoke the same language as the Chinese and understood and appreciated their culture, maybe you'd get on. And there wouldn't be,
Right,
like
yes. Well,
pointless,
yes. Hmm.
xenophobic, this kind of culture of xenophobic hatred in the
Yeah.
UK.
Yeah.
But it's just like, yeah, I think that I mean, I've reported on the leaked emails of Richard Dearlove, who's the former MI6 chief, and
Yeah.
like, and
Yeah.
some of the thing that it was quite clear that I mean he was part of this kind of wider cabal, kind of informal, of like military and intelligence veterans, and who they were all completely insane and very paranoid. And like when their communications from the start of the proxy war erupting, like they were sharing like mainstream stories about how Russians had never seen toilet before, and they believed it. Like, I mean, it's just like, and I think that there is a huge garbage in, garbage out aspect here, where the intelligence services and a variety of different sources of propaganda, they flood the media with absolute rubbish, and then the media informs what major decision makers in the military and intelligence services, and but also politics and the departments of state think, when it's complete and utter garbage. And it's like I
Yeah.
on the subject of Ukraine, I think I reported extensively on this. There's a guy called Chris Donnelly who he was a veteran British military intelligence guy, and he was I think he was part of the Soviet research unit within the Ministry of Defence for many years, and in the 90s he led the process of NATO expansion in the former Warsaw Pact countries, but he also started laying the foundations for it in the former Yugoslavia. Now, he started from, I think, from Maidan onwards, and he was very heavily embedded with kind of the ultra nationalists who took power in Kiev following that. That like he started banging the drum that, oh well, we're at war with Russia, we just don't know it, and that like the civil conflict in Donbass, which is Ukrainians brutally repressing their native Russian population, is it's like a miniature World War III, and it's this secret Russian invasion of Europe. And like, I mean, he's a complete and utter lunatic. And I've spoken to people who knew him in NATO, and he was regarded as a nutter then, and he was absolutely convinced. I've heard this from several sources that the Red Army was being withdrawn from Europe as part of a wider military deception, and actually the Soviet Union wasn't going anywhere, which is just complete and utter insanity. Anyway, the point is that he now occupies a very influential position within the Ministry of Defence, overseeing Britain's proxy war strategy, which is one of relentless escalation. And he openly talks in leaked briefings about the necessity of countering US resistance to further escalation, because they think that the Russians only understand force, and they'll back down eventually if only we hurt them enough and show them that we're serious enough. And it's like, I mean, that's just deeply problematic, as a position to have with any adversary, even your most bitter foe. But also, in the wake of, he's not really seen in public particularly, but like in the wake of Prigozhin's rather pointless and flaccid rebellion, Donnelly wrote an op-ed for the Financial Times where he stated that that Prigozhin's mutiny was of earth-shattering significance, and it showed that Putin's on his way out. Of course, it was a completely irrelevant event that resulted in nothing, changed nothing, and was promptly forgotten about, within days. But that's the kind of mindset that people who are in, significant positions of influence within Western power structures, that this is how they think, and the kind of information they're getting from their sources.
Sources.
And
I mean,
it's very worrying. It's very worrying.
yeah, yeah. I know a former. I worked for a former ambassador to Moscow who shall remain nameless, but also screwed up in Afghanistan. I'll leave it there. Every now and again, he'd show me this thing that he said, "Oh, don't share it with anybody. I've got it from a source." And you'd read it, and it looked like some crap straight out of the Daily Express. It's like it's like he spent too long going on Cub Scout trips with his kids or something. Reading sort of I don't know, Secret Seven books. I don't know. It just but that sounds very very familiar to me. But back to Richard Moore. I mean, he speaks fluent Turkish. And actually, he's been a keen advocate, including when he's working at the Foreign Office itself, the normal Foreign Office. But the problem is that the universities are shutting down. We're crap at Arabic. Less than half our students, pass Arabic. It's only about two-thirds for Russian and Mandarin. It's just a UK. It's a UYOK problem. It's just like we don't see the value of studying foreign languages as part of diplomacy. Yeah. Anyway, don't get me started on that. I mean, that was fantastically. Yeah. I mean, we should, if we ever meet, have a kind of pint and sort of share war stories about some of this stuff. Would be really kind of good fun. But I think that's probably it for today. I think. But that's fascinating, actually, really, really fascinating. So much kind of strikes a chord that we're kind of driven by lunatics in the asylum, you know,
Yeah.
on
Yeah,
bad.
well, I mean, it's this is the thing is that I mean, it gives me some the response to this gives me some hope because you see that the level of public resistance to this all over the Western world. Like, I mean, Trump launched this despite the fact that there was not majority support amongst his hardcore voters for this, let alone, I mean, the overwhelming majority of Americans oppose this. I do, I mean, I hope that this leads to some level of recalculation, amongst, amongst European countries, amongst, in the US, because, yeah, it's just so interesting that the level of public hostility to this, and I think Zach Polanski of the Greens. I mean, I think that he's quite problematic, and the Green Party has all sorts says all sorts of things I don't agree with. But by the same token, he is appearing publicly on the news and in mainstream news outlets, and is condemning Israeli and US aggression. And it's like the people are not exposed to this in the mainstream at all. And I think I hopefully it will have as we've discussed in other areas a knock-on effect, and there will actually be some sense really, because this doesn't serve our interests at all. It makes us less safe having this belligerent approach. And I think that, I mean, just to bring things full circle, you mentioned the level of projection. I mean, I think that it's always hilarious to speak about when you hear British and American politicians talk about Iranian expansionism, or like Iranian meddling, and it's like, well, I mean, they naturally have a sphere of influence, and have had for centuries. It was the same with Russia. It's like, I mean, does the Russia operating state media in Eastern European countries? I mean, is that some horrendous plot to destabilize the region and discredit NATO, or are they just operating in a region which they have enormous cultural, historical, political, financial ties to? I mean, it's just it's invariably seen as sinister by people in power. It's not typically by average people. And that's not because average people are stupid.
Yeah. And you look at BBC Persian, which, oh my God,
Mm,
which is a pure state propaganda, a UK state
mm.
propaganda outlet. It's quite shocking. But we're basically screwed, Kit, is what I can conclude from this. Unless, I mean, 'cause I think Trump is screwed either way. He's screwed if he stops now. He's screwed if he carries on. Not that I really care, because that's domestic US politics. But and
Mm.
I mean screwed in that particular context. But I mean, I think the sooner they get an off ramp off of this, the better, really. But it already feels like the kind of the politics at home is kind of nudging or dragging him towards that direction. But let's hope that it does. I mean, in terms of Starmer, I just think he's hedging with Trump because he, like many others in Europe, they're hedging a bit because they want Trump's to keep his foot down on Ukraine, and not sort of give up Ukraine completely. I mean, that's my fear. But yeah, that's a conversation for another day. Thank you so much.
Indeed.
I mean, it's been great to actually meet you for the first time, and
My
find that we
pleasure.
have something in common, including Richard Sackwell, who taught you, when you were a young, sprightly student. So yeah.
Yeah, it's all been downhill since then. But no, I mean, in all seriousness, no, I greatly enjoyed it, Ian. And yeah, let's stay in touch, my friend.
Yeah, let's do this again, mate. And yeah, thanks so much for joining, and thanks everybody for watching. Please like and subscribe if you find these videos helpful. Wherever you are in the world, whatever your religion, whatever your nationality, I wish you very much peace. And Kit, once again, mate, thanks very much for joining today. Let's do this
My
again.
pleasure.
Bye
Absolutely. God
bye for
bless
now.
you.